Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Grace today. My name is Nate Nims, if we haven't met yet. It is good to be with you today, for those with us in person and those watching online as well. Thank you all for being with us. We've got a few announcements today, and one of the first things that I'll share with you all is that last week we had a send-off for the 16 and up youth group members that are on their trip to France. They left on Wednesday last week and flew into France, and today they are, they probably would have already done this with the time change, but this morning in France they went to the beaches of Normandy to celebrate the 4th of July there, and they'll be in France for about another week, so keep the youth group in your thoughts and prayers as they're on this trip with one another. We want to also announce that our Vacation Bible School is starting this Wednesday. It's going to be every Wednesday night going forward through the first Wednesday in August. And we've got some sign-up sheets at the information table in the lobby. And Corrine, who is currently in our nursery, can answer any questions, and I can help introduce them to you later if you want. But you can get involved with that on Wednesdays going forward for kids. Or if anyone wants or needs an at-home version of Vacation Bible School, we also have that available. I also want to lift up that throughout the summer is the time that school supplies go on sale, and every fall we have an in-gathering in the United Methodist Church where we collect various items that folks need for back-to-school kits and then distribute them around the world through the United Methodist Committee on Relief. And if you'd like to get that list of the items that are needed for the school kits that we'll have, you can find that in the bulletin that we have, which is available on our website at gracedesmoines.org. We're not quite to having printed bulletins back just yet. We probably will later this summer, but on our website you can find the bulletin for the service with that list of school supplies. Also want to lift up and ask that you all keep the Jane family in your thoughts and prayers. Eric Jane, the son of Carlos Jane, clergy person and pastor and member here at the church. Eric passed away and was killed in a car accident on Friday in North Dakota. Eric worked as a veterinarian with indigenous communities and was helping to set up a free vet clinic on the Rosebud Reservation, and on their way back to Iowa, they were struck by a truck and passed away in a very large accident. So services are pending at this time. We don't have any more details yet, but keep Carlos and Betsy Jane in your thoughts and prayers, and also Eric's partner as they move through this time together. Those are the announcements that we have for this moment, but we'll pause now for a moment of silence to center ourselves and know that God is with us before we continue with the rest of worship.
I invite you to join me in the call to worship that will be on the screen. Your God is the God of Exodus, the God who hears your cry. God leads us into freedom. Your God feeds you with manna from heaven. You don't need to squirrel away sugar for the bitter days ahead. God will provide. Trust in the grace of God. I invite you to stand as you're able and join in our opening hymn, Here I Am, Lord. Please be seated. I invite you to join in our opening prayer. Holy God, in the daily round from sunrise to sunset, remind us again of your holy presence hovering near us and in us. Free us from shame and self-doubt. Help us to see you in the moment-by-moment possibilities to live honestly, to act courageously, and to speak from our wisdom. Amen. Our reading comes from the second book in the Bible, the book of Exodus, in the 3rd chapter, verses 7 through 10, and chapter 4, verse 13. Then the Lord said, I've clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I've heard their cries of injustice because of their slave masters. I know about their pain. I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians in order to take them out of that land and bring them to a good and broad land, a land that's full of milk and honey, a place where the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites all live. Now the Israelites' cries of injustice have reached me. I've seen just how much the Egyptians have oppressed them. So get going. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said, please, my Lord, just send someone else. Here ends the reading of God's word for God's people. Thanks be to God.
Right now at Grace, we are in the midst of a series of sermons looking at some of our most common fears and what we can do with those. And one of the most repeated phrases in the Bible is do not be afraid. That refrain comes up again and again. God says, don't be afraid. And that repetition, it reminds us of a couple things. That God doesn't want us to live with fear. That fear is not supposed to be the foundational feeling of our lives. But the repetition of do not be afraid also says to us, we live with a lot of fears and anxieties. Otherwise, God wouldn't have to say to the people so often, don't be afraid. There are all sorts of anxieties and worries and fears that we wrestle with. And so we need this reminder, don't be afraid. Now, the fear that we are looking at today is one of the most common fears in humanity. It is one that we all have, which is odd because with as common as this fear is, it is rare that we talk about how common this fear is, and that is the fear of failure. Now, a few weeks ago when we got started with this series of sermons, if you were with us, you might remember that we talked a bit about the flight or fight response. That your amygdala acts up and there are different chemical reactions that take place in your body that prepare you to either protect yourself or run away. This is an automatic response that we all have. It's a bit like an internal fire alarm that gets us ready for action one way or another. And it is a good thing. Through evolution, we have been given this good gift of God so that our bodies can respond in ways to threats before we even are consciously aware of how our bodies are reacting and trying to protect ourselves. Now, what gets tricky about this internal alarm system that we have is that it responds in the same physiological way. The same changes take place in our bodies, and these changes take place whether or not you are being protected from lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Like the ancient folks, if they were in the savannah and saw a lion, they would react in the same way we would. But we react in a different way as well, because let's say you go to the grocery store and you're standing in the aisle where it says clearly 10 items or less. But you notice that the person in the cart in front of you has 19 items, and you know you're in trouble because they have a cart, and if you're in the 10 items or less line, you should have a basket. But they are standing in front of you with their 19 items, and you only have 3. And the same sort of feelings of anxiety, frustration, and even fear spark up in that moment, even though standing in the line at the grocery store and being hunted by a lion are vastly different experiences. In one of them, you are lunch. In the other, you are only shopping for lunch. But if those situations stress you out, the same physiological reaction happens, and you are just sparked and amped up for this fight or flight. And things get even trickier for us because we have that same reaction if we only imagine a threat. For us, it does not matter if a threat is real or only in our heads, because if it is in our heads, that physiological response starts and we get amplified. We enter into that fight or flight shift. So, with this fear of failure, perhaps our biggest fear with failure is difficult to define. Failure can be a tricky thing to really say, this is how I failed, because the easiest way to talk about failure is to say that it's a lack of success. But what is that lack of success for you? Now, I'll just speak for myself, and before I go further in this, I really need you to know, I'm not fishing for compliments. This is not me trying to have you, soothe me and tell you that I do good, because I know I do okay. And I know I do okay because people keep showing up even after I feel like I failed. So clearly I don't suck at this, right? I'm at least tolerable. I know I'm not awful. But every week, I recognize, at least for myself, that I stuttered through the second sentence and someone noticed that. So clearly, I cannot succeed, and therefore I was a failure. Every time I speak in public, I think to myself, that could have been explained a little better. That paragraph should have been moved to another spot. This sentence really didn't make any sense. So if I wasn't a success, all that's left is failure, and I feel like I was utterly wrong. That's the struggle with failure. Because it's a lack of success and failure is so tricky to define, we can beat ourselves up really easily. Now, I don't remember this as much as I should, but it is worth reminding ourselves that sometimes what we imagine as a failure is what someone else could picture as success. I think about it like this. Right now, there are just over 7.5 billion people in the world, and it is hard to picture 7.5 billion people. So at that scale, things get tricky. But let's think about life if it was only 100 people. If there were only 100 people in the world, 18 of those people would not have any access to electricity, and 14 of those people would not be able to read or write. Only 7 of those people would have a college degree. 60 of those people would not have any internet access. If the world was 100 people, 78 people would have a home, but 22 people would be experiencing homelessness. And while 91 of us would have access to safe drinking water, 9 people would not have any safe water to drink. So if we think of success in terms of health or safety or education, how many of us are at the pinnacle of success in this life right now? I know that I stumble through my words each week, and I don't just do that. I'll tell you my most neurotic fear of failure that I have from public speaking. It gets really warm under these lights. And I even have 2 lights pointed at me from the pulpit so you can see my face a little better. So it gets a little warm up here. And that's honestly why I don't wear the big clergy robe, because that makes it even hotter. But sometimes I think to myself, I should wear that clergy robe because I start to sweat. And then because I'm sweating, I think to myself, you can see that I'm sweating. And because you all can see that I sweat, I think they're going to notice how this armpit starts to sweat more than this one. And it does. I'm not telling you to notice it the rest of the service, but just, it's one of those weird things about my body where this armpit stain will be about double the size of this one. And I don't know why, but I imagine you all see it and obsess about it like I do. And I feel like a failure again. That's the tricky thing with this fear of failure. We get stuck in those cycles of thoughts where we can imagine a worst case scenario where we're not completely successful, so of course we failed and we just didn't do what we needed to do. Now, with failure, maybe it's not we're afraid of failing as much as we are afraid of the feeling of being a disappointment, of not really getting one another's approval, or maybe even more apt, we're afraid of the feeling of shame. The psychologist Gary Winch wrote in Psychology Today that shame is a physiologically toxic emotion because instead of feeling bad about our actions, guilt, or our efforts, regret, shame makes us feel bad for who we are. Shame gets to the core of our egos, our identities, our self-esteem, and our well-being, and our emotional well-being. Guilt can be a reminder that we made a mistake. And regret can be that feeling that we didn't quite do what we needed to do. But shame tells us that we are the mistake, that we are the fault and the flaw, we are the failure. It is not that we experienced a failure. Shame says, you are this failure, you are that mistake. And it eats away at our ego and the core of our being. That's why Maya Angelou, after writing 11 books and winning countless awards, Maya Angelou wrote to herself, I've run a game on everybody and they're going to find me out. She thought she was a fraud that failed. Or Albert Einstein, shortly before his death in 1955, he wrote to himself and said, I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler, that he was a fault and a fraud. Now, it is difficult to imagine a more inspiring poet or successful scientist than Albert Einstein and Maya Angelou, but they felt like frauds and failures. They felt like their lives and their talents were a mistake, that they didn't earn or achieve anything, that they were just sort of faking their way through and failing from one failure to the next, and nobody noticed for some reason. And what they both experienced isn't just the fear of failure. What they experienced is that other shoe that drops. It's the commonly known imposter syndrome. Now, when we are afraid of failing, it can be easy to assume that our accomplishments are an accident. And according to the International Journal of Behavioral Sciences, 70% of us, and myself is included in that, 70% of us live what is academically known as imposterism, or sometimes called the imposter phenomenon. It was the psychologist Pauline Rose Clance who first began to study this feeling of being an imposter in the late 70s. As a psychology professor, she noticed that some of her undergraduate students, even though they had good grades, most of them had an A average across the board at the university, she noticed that a lot of them felt like they didn't really earn their grades. And a few of her students even came to her and said, I feel like my admissions letter was an accident, and I'm waiting for the day for the admissions department to recognize that my letter should have gone to someone else, and I lose everything. Now, she knew that these students had a false sense of failure, that they weren't imposters, that they were actually very successful and talented persons. But the more that she thought about it, the more Pauline realized she had those same feelings of failure and being an imposter when she was a student. So academically, this imposter syndrome is known as imposterism because none of us really like to be called an imposter. We don't like that feeling of being a fraud. And to call it a syndrome makes it seem like it is a disease, or it downplays how universal this feeling is as an abnormality, but it is very normal. And the examples of Maya Angelou and Albert Einstein, that reminds us that no amount of success can get rid of this fear. It just lingers there in the back of our minds no matter what. And we have those intrusive thoughts of, I just got lucky. It wasn't really my work that made a difference, it was somebody else. I just did this by accident. I'm faking my way through, and someday people are going to realize how I got things wrong and everything's going to collapse. And I used to have a recurring dream in seminary, especially my last year of seminary, when I was getting ready to graduate from grad school. And it was one of those sort of dreams that I knew this wasn't going to happen. But when I was in high school, between my freshman and sophomore year, I changed schools because we moved from Cedar Rapids to Spencer. And in Cedar Rapids, we had a different school schedule than they had in Spencer. Cedar Rapids was trimesters, and Spencer was just semesters. So I imagined that somehow between my freshman and sophomore year, my classes didn't really transfer from one school to another. And if my classes didn't transfer, then the grades that went along with it and everything that required my high school graduation, that wasn't really valid anymore. And if my high school graduation wasn't valid, then my college graduation wasn't valid. And then all the work that I did in seminary didn't count. So I was going to graduate with a degree and a lot of debt, but not really have that degree and be stuck living in a van down by the river. Right? Like, we can just get ourselves in those patterns of thoughts about worst case scenarios and feelings of fraud and failure and tell ourselves, we didn't deserve this, we didn't earn it, we can't have this. We can't even try to make things better or try to achieve what we need to do. And that's what we see in the reading from Exodus 3 today. So at the beginning of Exodus chapter 3, Moses is taking care of his father-in-law's sheep. And his father-in-law's name is Jethro. So we get this detail at the very start of Exodus chapter 3 that Moses is doing something for his father-in-law. And when the Bible gives details like that, it can be helpful to ask ourselves, well, if Moses was doing this now, what was Moses doing before? So if you back up to the beginning of the book of Exodus, it's the story of when Moses was born. And what's going on in Egypt around that is the Pharaoh, who has enslaved the Israelites, is worried that they're going to rise up in rebellion and fight against the Egyptians. So the Pharaoh says to the midwives, to those that are watching the Israelites give birth, make sure you kill all the boys. But there are two midwives, their names are Shiphrah and Puah. They practice civil disobedience, they break the law to do the right thing, and because of that, Moses' life is spared. Shortly after that, Moses is placed in this basket and sent down the river, conveniently by where the Pharaoh's daughter was taking a bath for the day. Moses is then adopted into the family of the Pharaoh and raised up in this family of power and privilege, but never really knows how things beyond the palace gates are operating. Until one day when Moses was probably in their 40s or so, they decide to see what life is like on the other side of the tracks. So Moses leaves the palace, enters the city, and sees an Egyptian slave master beating an Israelite. So Moses decides to do something about it. They fight with the slave against the slave master, and Moses ends up killing that captor. They commit, at the very least, manslaughter. And because of that, Moses decides that he has to flee. He doesn't want to be attacked. He doesn't want retribution to come his way, so he runs away into the desert, eventually meets Jethro's daughter, and then starts to take care of Jethro's sheep. So Moses has fled from his life and now finds himself wandering as a shepherd, taking care of sheep. And one day, while tending to the flock, Moses is walking them through the wilderness, and Moses notices that a bush is burning. And that's not all that odd in the wilderness of Egypt. In the Near East, it's very dry, so grasses and bushes burn very often, and it only takes a spark to get one of those flames going. But Moses lingers for a little bit. Moses sees this flame going, but pays attention to it, because what Moses notices is that the bush is burning, but it's not being burned up. The flames are not consuming the bush. So it's one thing to notice a flame, but it's another to notice it so closely that you see that it's not being burned up and consumed. And one of the things that this passage tells us is that there is potential and possibility all around us. As some folks have said, there are burning bushes almost everywhere we look. We just have to notice them and pay attention to them. So Moses pays attention. They see this burning bush, and because of that, they have this holy moment where God cries out to Moses to lead the people into freedom. God says to Moses at the beginning of Exodus 3:7, "I've clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I have heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. I know about their pain. I've come down to take them out of the land and bring them into a good and wide land, a land that is full of milk and honey. So get going. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." So Moses is told, you have this invitation to bring the people into freedom. You need to do the right thing. And God tells Moses, I am going to be with you. And for the next few chapters, all of the rest of chapter 3 and halfway through chapter 4, Moses keeps coming up with excuse after excuse as to why they can't do it. Until eventually Moses just says, please, my Lord, just send somebody else. Like, let anybody else take care of this. I can't. I don't want to. Just give it to somebody else. Now, in her book, How to Fail, the author Elizabeth Day writes, adventures do by definition involve risk. But not having an adventure means missing out on life, a far greater risk. Moses would rather miss out on their life than take this risk and try to take the chance. They would rather say no because they're afraid of failing, so why try? Why take this risk? Why take this chance when you can just say no from the start and go back to the life you already know? Moses, it seems, is so afraid of failure, they're afraid to take a chance. And even though it's the right thing to do, even though God says to Moses, I will be with you, and then God also says, your brother Aaron will be with you every step of the way as well. Aaron knows that Moses doesn't have to do this alone, but Moses still says, no, just send anybody else. Anyone but me. Moses keeps coming up with excuses so they don't have to take the next step forward because Moses is afraid of that risk. And maybe it's not just that Moses is afraid of risk or failure. Moses might even be afraid of success, about moving forward in this new way, because whatever the status quo is in our lives, even if it's disappointed, we're prepared for that. We can prepare ourselves for a disappointment. We can prepare ourselves for a letdown, but getting prepared for success can be a little trickier. We don't know what we're going to do if we really succeed. So imagine you're getting ready for an interview and you're already talking yourself out of whatever job you are applying for. So it's easier to think to yourself if you're preparing for an interview, well, I don't know if they're going to shake my hand. So if I reach out for my hand but they go for a fist bump, what do? Do I do the turkey thing? Right? Or if they do a fist bump but I went for an elbow, what happens then? Like, I don't know if they're going to want to shake my hand or not. So how do I prepare for this interview if I don't even know how I'm going to be able to shake their hand, if I can shake their hand at all? It's really easy to get obsessed with a thought like that, and it's a little easier to get obsessed over those details than to prepare for an interview and actually think about the questions they might ask and be ready for them when they come. We can get stuck in those self-defeating patterns of life that lead us away from the success that we could just walk through if we reminded ourselves we don't have to be afraid. So Moses knows exactly what they need to do. He's been told, don't be afraid. He's been told that Aaron is going to be with him. He will not be alone. God says, I will be with you. Don't be afraid. And Moses keeps saying, no. Give it to somebody else. I'd rather not. Now, some of you know that I like to ride my bike, and I've been on RAGBRAI a few times over the years, and that's a picture of me and John Karras after I rode 100 miles that day and was rewarded for those 100 miles with a picture of John Karras, who did compliment my outfit. Now, on RAGBRAI, I've ridden with Team Flamingo, and we kind of stick out. And sticking out can be helpful unless you make a mistake that sort of throws somebody off on the ride. I don't know if anyone's followed the Tour de France, but recently a woman was holding a sign and it caused a massive accident because the sign clipped one of the riders and then everyone else behind fell over because it was just dominoes. So the very first time that I rode on RAGBRAI, the members of my team that have been doing RAGBRAI for, some of them almost 40 years now, told me the mistakes that first-time riders make. And they said almost every newbie on RAGBRAI makes the same two mistakes. They slip the gears of their bike when they're going uphill, and then because they slip the gears, they can't get off to the side, and they slow everybody else down around them. And I thought to myself, there is no way I'm going to make those mistakes. I've been riding a bike since I'm a kid. Clearly, this is going to be easy because it's just like riding a bike, right? Like I told myself all would be fine. So the very first day, I am wearing all bright pink. I have a feather boa in my helmet. I have pink glitter on myself because we're Team Flamingo, so why wouldn't we? And we go up the first hill, and I shift my gear at the wrong spot. And because of that, I slip the chain, and it falls in between the gears on my bike, and I'm stuck. And I can't move forward, and I'm wearing this bright pink, obnoxious outfit in the middle of the road with cyclists splitting around me because I'm stuck in the middle and I can't get to the side to fix my bike. That was the first day of my first RAGBRAI and the very first hill that I went up. And I felt so much like a failure that I was like, I'm done. Like, why even try after this? I tried, I failed, I'm embarrassed, and now everybody knows. Like 12,000 people on bikes just saw me that I was stuck in the middle of this road, so I just can't go on. Now I did. I finished that RAGBRAI, but the odd thing about failure is I can vividly remember the feeling of being stuck on that hill a lot more than I can all the other hills that I went up successfully. There were a lot of days that were just completely smooth and nothing went wrong with my bike, everything went fine, and I cannot remember almost any of those details because failure sticks out to us, in part, so we can learn from our mistakes. When we remember what went wrong, we can find ways to do things better the next time. But we also remember our failures a bit more than our successes because too often we don't take the time to cherish our successes, to really be mindful about what we are thankful for. And gratitude is one of the better therapeutic ways that we can deal with our fear of failure. And it's also an important practice of our faith. Now, just like Moses, we can come up with excuses. We can think of reasons as to why we might be embarrassed or afraid, or why we can't do what God is asking us to do. We can come up with any number of excuses, like our schedule just isn't flexible enough and we don't have the time for this, that we can tell ourselves we're too old, we're too young, we're too inexperienced, we just don't have the skills or talents, and we don't have the time to learn those skills and talents. We can keep coming up with excuses, and whatever excuse you can come up with, that's fine. But what is true of Moses is also true of you, because there is something that you are called to do. There's a way that you are supposed to share this liberation and this love of God, and you are not alone. You don't have to do this alone, and God is with you, so don't be afraid. You can take those steps forward. And when you do, just like Moses, you will still fail from time to time. Because in the story of Exodus, not too long after the Israelites are finally in freedom, they've walked across the Red Sea, but there's this failure that happens, and all of a sudden everybody wants to go back. They would rather go back to slavery than go forward with Moses, and Moses feels like a complete failure. And then after that, Moses feels like he has to take care of every little problem for the people. Moses is trying to act like the Lone Ranger, forgetting that the Lone Ranger also had Tonto, and we should really remember Tonto because they were the one that did all the work, even though the Lone Ranger gets all the credit. But Moses thought they had to take care of everything, and they failed again and again because of that, and eventually Aaron comes alongside and says, "Let me help you." And with all of those failures, they keep taking another step forward until they're closer and closer to the promised land. So you will fail often. And if I have not failed you yet, I will. also probably often. It's just something that happens. Sometimes our failures are a misunderstanding. Sometimes our failures is not living up to whatever our idea of success is. And there are also times where we fail and we fall completely on our face. But whatever failure you are going through, it could be the fuel that finally pushes you forward so that you can get to where you are going. Failure, just like our fear of it, is something that is universal. It is going to happen and we are going to be afraid, but there are still bushes that are burning all around us. There is still this call to be the people that God is leading us to be. And it's with all of this in mind that I want to talk about a little bit of a failure or an opportunity that we have right now. Now, whenever a pastor talks about a failure that they're trying to work on, I know there can be all sorts of imaginations that happen, because if a pastor fails, it must be something really bad. So I'll just tell you what this failure is, and it's not probably what you're imagining, but it is a failure that we're recognizing, and it's that we are struggling and oftentimes failing to get people connected throughout the different areas of the church. One of the things that we're recognizing is that in the past year, we were good at staying connected with folks for the most part, but we were connected in a lot of different segments. Other than Sunday morning, we had sort of isolated groups that were acting independently, and they were staying connected, but there was a difficulty of moving from one segment to another. And we've recognized that with newer folks, as they come to Grace, they might hear about what's going on, but they don't really know how to get a part of it. So if you're newer to Grace, you might not have a whole history, but 2 years ago, just before I got started, the church took a survey that asked about a whole bunch of questions and realities around the church, and we saw this sort of segmenting of the church, how it was difficult to get from one way to another, and you might know a lot about one area, but nothing about another. We did a follow-up survey that shared some of that same information, and we've just started a new group of folks that are going to be helping us re-enter the church as we come back together throughout the summer and fall, and they've talked about that as an issue as well. We have a lot going on, but we don't always know what's going on, and we don't always know how to be a part of it. And all of these sort of ideas are going on, and we're trying to figure out a way forward. Because we've recognized that we're not completely successful at doing this, which means we're kind of failing about it. And if you've been around Grace for a while, you might not think that that's an issue, and that's okay. You don't have to see that as a failure, and calling it a failure makes it sound worse than it is. But if you've been around Grace longer than I have, take the time to chat with someone that's been around a little more recently. And tell them one of your favorite things that we do as a church that's outside of Sunday morning, and see if they have any idea how to get connected to it. See how many names other than my name or the names of our staff folks might know. Because we have to do a better job of connecting with one another and connecting throughout this church so that we can be that body of Christ where we are all a part of this working together with and for one another. So we've started to recognize this issue, and we're going to try to move forward. But to move forward, I need your help. I need you to tell me what sort of burning bushes you're passionate about, what callings you see in your lives. I need you to know what is going on. Where do we need to go? What promised land can we find our way to? With the folks that are here and the folks watching online, what are the things that you are passionate about? What are the ways that we can try and we can fail and then we can try better the next time? What are you interested in? What are you passionate about? What would you like to get connected with, and where would you like to see Grace get involved in the community? And last week, if you were with us, we talked about the fear of loneliness, how isolation makes us even more isolated. And because we were talking about loneliness, in the back of my head all of last week, I kept thinking of ways that we could be more social. Like we could put on a picnic, we could have a movie night on the lawn, we could have a game night, we could have a bike ride, we could organize some sort of mission activity where people had to work together. There were all sorts of ideas that I came up with that would make us not lonely because we would be doing something together. But then I kept thinking to myself, well, I don't know if people would be interested in that. I don't know if people want to try this. I don't know if people really want to do this. And then I think to myself, well, the majority of folks are watching online and not in person yet. So if we do something, are we going to make those people feel more lonely because they're not here to do it with us? So how could we have them with us but then not really be with us? And I had all of these excuses that kept going through my head. And then the worst excuse that I had was that if we had a picnic, I would have to ask for help. And how could I ask for help? How could I go to someone and say, I need you to help me with this? Because you all have lives and schedules, and maybe you can't help with a picnic. But if I ask you and you say no, even though this thought isn't real or true in any way, I know the feeling is sometimes there that if you say no to the pastor, you're saying no to the church. And if you're saying no to the church, you're saying no to God. And if you're saying no to God, you better watch out because God is going to smite you. So how dare anyone ever say no to me? Clearly, I speak with the authority and power of God, so you have to say yes to me because otherwise you are saying no to Jesus. And I know that's not true. And I know there are excellent reasons for you all to say no to me a lot of the time. But I'm still thinking to myself, it's just easier to not try. Because if we try and fail, how are we going to feel? So let's just skip it and hope things get better next time. Over this summer at Grace, a lot of our regular programs and events, they're all sort of put on pause with vacation schedules and everything else. So we're not doing things as normal anyway, and we're still just coming out of this pandemic. So as we come out of this and now come together, what do we need to try? What are you passionate about? What do you want to get connected to? How can we move forward together? What burning bush do you want to see us listen to? I know there is more that we can do, and I know that there are more ways that we can get connected. I just need to know what burning bushes you're seeing and what direction God is leading you so that we can find a way to help one another and be the church with one another. Now this Sunday, today, we are sharing communion with one another. There were little baskets by the door, and if you didn't get one, that's fine. When we get to the moment of communion, you can raise your hand, and Joe, our usher today, will bring a packet to you. And we're doing communion a little differently with these little packets because we're still just in the midst of this pandemic. But I think of the Gospel of John today and how that tells the story of the Last Supper, because there's this moment in the Last Supper just before the meal that Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And it's an interesting moment because in the ancient world, people would walk the same roads with animals, and maybe they had sandals, but the sandals were really just a small flap at the bottom of their foot. So their feet were at the very least dirty when they entered somebody's home. So there was this tradition of having a wash bucket by the door of the house because as you entered, you would want to clean them because you don't want to track in all that dirt and muck and mud into somebody's home. But if you walked into a house with a group of people and you were the first person to wash your feet, what's the person behind you going to think? It's kind of like if you go somewhere and you open the door for someone and stand to the side, and then another person comes behind them and then you're still stuck standing the door. And then there's a third person that's a little farther back, so they pretend to jog and get through, and then you're still stuck holding that door. So all the disciples in the Gospel of John, none of them stop to wash their feet as they walk in, because none of them want to wash anyone else's feet. And we can understand why, because they walked through animal manure on the way to this home, and who wants to touch that? So the disciples just go on with the meal, but Jesus stops and washes all of their feet. It's this act of humble service. And Jesus then says, "This is what you must do for one another. As I have loved you, you must love one another." And in that moment around that meal at the Last Supper, Jesus knew that the disciples were going to fail him. Because Peter was going to deny him, Judas was going to betray him, and everyone else was going to flee from him. So Jesus could have let their failures stop him from trying, but he still loved them and told them to do the same, to try, to devote themselves to being this kind of person. So after washing the disciples' feet, Jesus says to them, "I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than their master, and no messenger is greater than the one who sent them. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." And this week, at least, I've been thinking a lot about that line, "if you do them." Jesus doesn't say, "if you succeed." Jesus doesn't say, "if you get everything right, you will be blessed." Jesus simply says, "do this. Serve one another. Live with humility and take care of folks. Love one another as you have been loved by God and by me. Do this and you will be blessed." The blessing is not about failure or success. Jesus simply says you're blessed when you do this. When you love one another, when you live with grace, when you dedicate your life to this goodness, that is where you are blessed. So Jesus simply asks us to try. So this week, may you try. May you do that and be blessed, because I didn't even mean to, but this one's empty because it's from the last time we took communion. So I failed, like from the start. And that's okay. We try, and we try again. And we try again because Jesus gathered with the disciples on the night that he was betrayed and said, "Take, eat. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And when the meal was over, Jesus took the cup, gave thanks to God, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Drink of this, all of you. Do this in remembrance of me, for this is the cup of the forgiveness of sins for you and for many." And so we, God's people, come together in remembrance of this moment of love made manifest in this meal, of this holy sacrament, this sacred moment that connects us with that table and everyone that has ever shared it, because we as God's people come together to do this and to remember that God is with us. Now, if you're here with us in person and you're sharing in one of these communion cups, and again, if you need one, raise your hand and Jill will get you one. I strongly recommend, if you open it, when you open the cracker side first. Because if you open the juice side and then flip it over to open the cracker side, that's another sort of failure that you don't really need today. But we share this sacrament with one another and with God and with the Christ who welcomes us to the table. And Christ, we know, welcomes everyone to the table, so everyone is always invited to share in this sacred moment. So let us pause now as we share communion, as we listen to and play, and as we think about the burning bushes in our midst and how we need to do this. Amen. We'll come together now in a time of prayer, and there's all sorts of prayers that we hold in our hearts, and especially this week we hold the Jane family together, thinking of Carlos with the passing of Eric, and all the other prayers on our hearts and minds God already knows. And if you have a prayer that you want to share with us at Grace, please let us know and we will be in prayer with you. But let us come together now. God, thank you for this moment and time where we can be together and remember we are not alone. We are here with one another, and you are here with us, encouraging us to move forward and be the people you are calling us to be. So God, help us to notice your burning bushes, help us to hear your call, and help us to rise above our excuses. Because whatever excuse we might come up with, your grace is still with us and your call still remains. So help us to trust and know that we don't have to be afraid, that our fear does not get the final say, and even though we will fail, we can try again because you are with us and we are with one another. God, we pray for all those who are on our hearts, those in times of grief as well as in those of celebration and joy. We trust that your hands hold all things together and that your mercy is sufficient and will meet us and everyone else wherever we are. So help us this day and always to take the next step with you and with one another as we remember the meal that Christ shared with the disciples and shares with us so that we can be your people on earth as it is in heaven. And that is why we now join together in the prayer that Christ taught, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. For those that are with us in person, if you would like to give an offering to financially support the church, you can do so on your way out by putting something in one of the collection baskets by the door. You can also always give online at gracedesmoines.org. But as always, our gifts are not just our finances, but our life. In the United Methodist Church, we make this covenant and promise with one another to share our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, and our witness to this church and to our community with one another. So may you be an offering this week. May you share grace. May you take that next step. May you rise above your excuse so that you can do what God is asking you to do this week and always. And now as the service comes to a close, I'd invite you to rise in body or in spirit, and we'll join together in our closing hymn. It's number 467 in the red hymnals or on the screen. We'll join together in singing Trust and Obey.
What a
So going into this week, may we trust God when they say to us, don't be afraid. We might have failures that come, and we will, but those failures don't get the final say. So may you go forward with God and know that we are all going with you so that we can find those burning bushes and share the liberation and love that God is leading us to. May we all go in peace as we strive to trust and obey. Amen.